What's up, UX fam? How's your mom and them? Welcome to another episode of Beyond UX Design. I'm Jeremy. If you're new here, welcome to the show. I am super stoked to have you. And if you haven't done it already, please consider subscribing to the show wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you are a regular here and you feel like you're getting something out of the show, I would really appreciate you leaving a 5-star review. That'll help me out so much more than you can imagine. And as always, thanks so much to Chris, Siraquan, Stacy, Radu, Megan, Andrew, John, Mark, and Kevin for all their support. And if you want to join those fine folks and help keep the show independent and ad-free, you can become a patron for as little as $3 a month. That's less than $1 an episode. That's a steal. And if you do that, you'll get some sweet, sweet perks for your support. And of course, if you think the show is worth sharing, then I would love it if you told some friends. I am so fortunate today. I am lucky to have a true gem of a UX professional. The UX community is so lucky to have Julia DeBari, and I am lucky to have Julia on the show today. Julia has flown from San Francisco to Stockholm for a 3-day weekend just to immerse herself in the experience. She approaches life with a quiet, principled version of humanism, deep thoughtfulness, and imagination, guided by her inner vision, personal values, conscientiousness, and integrity. And with over 2 decades in the field, Julia has dug into user experience design, design education, design process, and design operations. She's passionate about optimizing processes and facilitating workshops, and her mission is to help improve people's lives and businesses through human-centered design, systems thinking, and servant leadership. Julia, thank you so much for agreeing to come on the show. I'm so lucky. I'm so honored to have you on. How are you? Welcome to Beyond UX Design.
Great. Thank you for having me, Jeremy. I really appreciate, being on the show. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I am honored. I mean, you were involved with like so many things. I don't think I realized it, but I was listening to your episode that you were on Brave UX, and y'all listed out like everything. I'm like, oh my God, I never realized like Julia is on so much stuff. Like I follow you on LinkedIn, and obviously like all the stuff you're doing, I see that. But then when you put it in context, you're like, oh my God, where do you find the time? How do you do so much? So I appreciate you. I know you're busy, so thanks for coming on the show. So Julia, I'm really excited to have you come on. You have been involved with so many things in the UX industry, and I couldn't think of a better person to talk about this topic today, which is comparing all the UX education landscape and thinking about the options and everything else. So we're going to talk about that today. But before we do that, I introduced you a little bit, but I'd love you to kind of talk about yourself and tell us who you are and all that stuff, and we'll go from there.
Yeah. No, thank you so much again, Jeremy, for having me on the show. And I'm a really big fan of yours. Also follow you on
Oh,
LinkedIn.
thank you. I appreciate that.
I
I'm
love
honored.
everything you put out there. It's, lots to learn, even, being around the block a few times.
Right on. I appreciate
Yeah,
that.
I got my start in the dot-com bubble in San Francisco. Just got really lucky. I mean, I feel so bad with the market the way it is, but you could pretty much walk into a place and like, I know how to use a computer and you could like get a job. I know
Oh,
how to do
right.
HTML. I could get a job. So
How
it
the
was
times
definitely
have changed.
times have definitely changed. And my big thing was, I didn't think of a career when I got started. I didn't go to like art school or anything like that. I won't go into too much detail about my background. I did actually get a really helpful degree for UX, but it wasn't planned. Sort of fell into it like a lot of people back then. And yeah, I didn't have a plan. I didn't really know what to do, and I just really loved what I was doing, and I've been very lucky. And I think one thing that's different is I don't really focus on a career ladder. I recently learned a term, well, recently, 2018, of the career portfolio,
Oh, okay. I don't think
is
I've ever heard that.
really
Yeah.
just trying different things. So for me, I've stayed in the UX industry, but I've tried lots of different roles within the industry. I'm just curious. I want to try different things. I want to get a real big overview of the industry. And I'm not interested in like, oh, being, VP of design. For me, there's just too much politics once you work your way up the ladder, and I'm not remotely interested in dealing with that.
I heard that.
I care about the work itself and the people. So, yeah, I just want to tell people, you said we're going to talk about education sort of path, so to speak, and don't feel like you have to work your way up the ladder. Like, really, explore. And that's what UX is amazing for. Absolutely amazing, is there's so many different niches and specializations you can do within one single industry.
Yeah, and that's funny because that is kind of our job, is to be curious and ask questions and understand and uncover insights and all those other things. And so taking that and applying that, strategically to your career. I think that's something a lot of people might not think about. They just think about, oh, I got to get a job and then I'll do the UX. But you could take those concepts and apply that to your job hunt. And before your job hunt, which is what we're going to talk about today, is learning it in the first place and where you can go. And so there's just so many options out there. There are schools, there's 4-year programs, there's a plethora. And I'm coming up, like, I think I got my first UX job in 2011, and I don't know, 2011, I don't even know if there was a single 4-year degree. Maybe the coast, maybe LA or New York, they had something, but this was not widely adopted. So the really only way to do it was to teach yourself. This is pre-boot camp world, and now there's just like tons of boot camps, there's tons of schools, there's tons of online resources, free programs, it's everything. It's just so overwhelming for a lot of people. And one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on today was just because you've got experience. I know you worked at Career Foundry for a while. You've actually been in the bootcamp world. You've done that. You've worked in large corporations, small orgs, startups, and all that stuff. And you've got not only the experience, which I think is really valuable, of the education piece, but it's how that education is perceived by all these companies, which I think is really important to talk about too. So let's dig into it a little bit, Julia. I'm curious, from your perspective. I want to talk a little bit about just the education landscape and all the things that are available out there. We could probably spend hours and hours just talking about this alone. But from your perspective, high level, what are some of the things that to think about when we think about that education landscape?
Yeah, I think one thing, to your point in nowadays is it's actually a pretty saturated market for the educational landscape, but that doesn't mean that there's a lot of good opportunities out
Mm-hmm.
there as far as what you can do. There are some, and it's definitely not hopeless by any stretch. And I think the important thing to keep in mind is just how you learn and what kind of structure and the best way that different programs work for you. One thing to keep in mind, and I'm sure we'll probably talk about this later, is, a university degree or some sort of college degree goes through an accreditation program most of the time, which means that they have to follow certain rules set forth by the government. And so they're less flexible about what they can teach versus a boot camp or, self-learning or some other kind of educational platform. I'm like, I need to find a better term for all this landscape stuff. Um, don't require accreditation and they have no oversight because of that. So just something to keep in mind as you're out there looking, it's great because they're more flexible. They can add topics on a whim. You can get the maybe most up-to-date information, hypothetically, but there's no oversight as well as like, are they marketing fairly to students or
Right.
whatever that would be. So it's just something to keep in mind.
Now, question about this oversight, because this is something I'm really curious. I just recently talked with Aneta Kmiecik about architecture and the difference in how we teach architecture versus how we teach UX. And I've talked with Kevin Schertz about this as well and his experience. He's also an architect. So one of the things that I am curious about when you say accreditation, right, we're not speaking about UX type. It's not like, a lawyer can teach certain things a certain way or, a medical school can teach in general. We're not talking about
Right.
how they actually teach UX, because that is sort of like still the Wild West. And when you think about
Yeah.
accreditation, can you talk a little bit about what that means versus a boot camp? Like, what does that
Yeah.
actually mean?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, I was talking accreditation as far as
Right.
like an education program, but as far as UX, there is no a single accreditation. Like to your point of architecture or law or something, there are accreditations where there's certain criteria an educational institution or platform needs to meet in order to say like, okay, you're now a lawyer, you're now an
Mm-hmm.
architect, but we have nothing like that in UX at all. And
Mm-hmm.
it makes me really sad, honestly. And
Yeah.
another thing I found out, maybe it's been a year or two. I'm not sure if people are familiar with the ISO, International Standards Organization.
I remember
Um,
you posting about this on LinkedIn, but yeah, for those who
yeah,
aren't aware, go ahead. Yeah, tell us about that.
yeah. So it's really just a thing that's international. So if you say I'm an architect and you go to China and you're like, I'm an
Mm-hmm.
architect, everybody's on the same page
Yeah,
on what
yeah.
an architect means.
Can you imagine
We've
that for
had
UX? Like
that.
how? Can
Well,
you
so we
imagine
were
that?
there for 5 years. We were in the ISO for five
Oh,
years, and now
really?
we've been dropped.
Oh,
And I
geez.
don't know why. Well, I did find out. So, what I did find out is it requires a sponsor, like a company or an organization to sponsor it. And UX doesn't have anything.
Really?
Yeah, and
Wow.
I was
Okay.
like, "Wait, how do you just drop?" Like we were in there for like it was the 2000 like 10 to 2015 we were in the ISO and now we're no
Hmm.
longer there as like a
Who
UX term.
who sponsored it before? Do you know?
It doesn't say
It
maybe
doesn't say.
you have to pay, of course, to be
Oh,
part of the
I'm sure it's expensive.
organization. And I
Yeah.
was like, I'm not going to pay thousands of dollars just to find this piece of information.
I'm surprised like Apple or Google or something doesn't
A
sponsor that.
hundred
That's bizarre.
percent.
Yeah,
I
it's
also
weird.
thought like maybe Jared Spool or
Right. Yeah.
those big like Don Norman
Sure.
or those kind of people. They're are I sadly want to say grandfathers these
Yeah.
days.
Sure. Yeah.
Likes that they would like really put that forward, and so I am honestly curious about what our grandfathers of UX are thinking and not supporting more like an accreditation for our criteria, I should say, for our education.
Yeah, that's well. If you can introduce me to either one of them, I'll get them on the show and I'll ask them. but okay, well, so that's interesting. So we don't, yeah. So that's just a note when we talk about this. So it's kind of interesting because as we talk about boot camps versus university programs, there's certainly differences between the two. But I think one thing maybe we should maybe I don't want to put words in your mouth, but tell me if I'm wrong. We should be thinking about the actual things we're learning may not be as quote unquote trustworthy from a university simply because they get that accreditation, right? Is that an accurate
100%,
statement?
100%. I can
All
give
right.
a quick example.
Yeah, please do.
The mentee, she could get a free bachelor's degree based on where she worked.
Oh, wow. That's a good deal.
And so she was like, I'm going to get a UX degree. It's free. Why not?
Yeah, why not? Sure.
And so I was like, well, before you jump in, like, why don't you just take one class and like see how it goes?
Oh, can you do that?
Like,
Is that something you can do?
yeah, so they actually
Like a
had like a
trial?
certificate program that then you would transfer to the bachelor.
Ah, okay. Okay.
So it was still a semester. It was your
Mm-hmm.
standard college semester. So she did it, and her instructor had zero UX experience,
Oh,
like
wow.
zero, and
Holy
was
cow.
literally just reading through like what the syllabus said. And when my mentee would ask questions, she couldn't answer those questions.
Right. And so that's like so sad because you can imagine, I mean, I just can't imagine an architecture instructor doing that and getting
Hmm.
away with it or law school or medical school instructor.
Exactly.
Oh, that's frustrating. Well, so let's talk about this. So when we think about the landscape, in my head, I'm thinking boot camps, 4-year degree, self-taught. Is there more than that, or is that about right? Or what are your thoughts?
Well, it depends how much you want to get into the details. I mean, Udacity has nano degrees,
Mm-hmm.
Coursera has these too, and they're, some of them can be good. They're partnering with universities. You can get Harvard and University of Michigan and stuff like doing the content. So
Mm-hmm.
they're not boot camps in the sense that, it's General Assembly or Career Foundry or something.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, there's just a lot of options. There's free options, there's self-study, there's universities, there's colleges, there's certificates, 1-year certificates. Yeah, there's just a
Yeah.
lot out there. Pretty much any kind of educational platform you can think of is available for UX.
Right. And which is again overwhelming. So let's like think about this. If I'm an aspiring designer, a UX professional, I'm
Mhm.
an aspiring UX professional, because maybe they don't want to be visual designers, maybe they want to be researchers, whatever. So let's think of like aspiring UX professional. I've got all these things out there. Let's break down in like the major groups that you would maybe want them to think about, so that hopefully by the end of this podcast interview, they'll be able to say, all right, I'm a little bit more informed and I think I have a better idea of what works for me. So you want to start with boot camps? Does that make sense to
Sure.
start there? All right.
Yeah.
So let's talk about boot camps. General thoughts. Boot camps obviously get a lot of hate from a lot of people. It's often very divisive, polarizing conversation. People love them, people hate them. Very few people are indifferent. I'm curious from your perspective, pros and cons, things like that from a boot camp.
Yeah, I mean, one positive thing about boot camps is they are structured. If you're someone who's like, yeah, I just don't have that internal intrinsic
Mm-hmm.
motivation, boot camp might be for you. Definitely also if you're a career changer, boot camp might be for you. Like if you're a career changer, excuse me, who needs structure, a boot camp could be for you. And then one thing to think about boot camps, there are what we call full-time boot camps, which are like 40 hours a week.
Mm,
You can't
okay.
work a job. And there's part-time boot camps where they're like 10 to 15 hours a week of work. And then the rest of the time, hopefully you're working or, doing something to bring in money. And so based on whether you go full-time or part-time is the length of time for the boot camp. The average full-time boot camp is 12 weeks. There's some shorter, some longer. And then the average part-time is 6 to 9 months, depending. Sometimes they say 6 months and then you can extend it because you're like, oh, I didn't finish something. And so they'll let you extend. I think Career Foundries is 9 months. And I don't know if we put this under boot camps or certificate programs, which can be 9 months to a year,
Okay.
that are usually associated with a college or some kind of school.
Okay. So that's like for instance, I know like our mutual friend Megan Thomas, she runs the UC Berkeley
Yeah.
extension. So it's like technically not UC. I know when we were talking, someone was like, "You're not a professor. You're not on the list or whatever," and she was like, "I'm," But so that technically is that an example like when you're talking about where it's sort of sponsored by but not technically
Yeah.
part of the larger. Okay.
And that gets even more squirrely. So what's funny is UC Berkeley has their own UX program, like you would
Oh,
take
like a 4-year degree. Okay.
for your degree. It's not called UX, but it's basically
Mm-hmm.
something where they mix psychology and design and
Sure.
computer science.
Yeah.
Um, then they have their 1 year certificate through them. Then they have a third option, which is the one that Megan did. And the reason I know this is I was hired to do two of the courses for the internal UC Berkeley certificate.
Oh,
And
okay.
then they scrapped it because they were just buying the program that Megan has, which is Trilogy Education, which I think 2U bought. And so they partner with about 15 to 20 universities around the country to offer a program. So it looks like, to your point, oh, UC Berkeley, I got a certificate at UC Berkeley, but is it the 2U one, or is it their
Interesting.
internal one, or is it
Okay.
the degree program?
Now, I actually had no idea that that was a thing, and now that I'm thinking about it, it does make sense that companies would do that, reuse it, license it, and allow. So maybe we're going to go off topic, but I kind of want to dig into this a little bit.
Yeah.
This sort of, I don't know if you kind of call it method. It almost sounds at the surface like it could be a nefarious thing, but I don't think it's necessarily nefarious. I'm curious, like your perspective on this, like the 4-year program. When it comes, I don't want to call out UC Berkeley necessarily. So
Yeah.
let's just
There's
say
tons
four
of
year
other
four
schools.
year university or main traditional university does a program, then they have the certificate, then they outsource this to another company but slap their name on it. Is it possible to compare those three options even on their own, or is it such like is it so drastically different across the board that it's almost impossible to generalize?
No, I think you could compare them. So one thing like with the 2U, like third party outsource thing, is their program is exactly the same at every single school that they partner with.
Ah,
Like they
right.
just sell a
Okay,
package exactly the same.
that makes
If you
sense.
ask for the syllabus for that
It's gonna
program, you can automatically tell. Um,
Interesting.
I
Okay.
actually don't know if UC Berkeley actually still has their internal certificate that I was working on. I was actually let go because they're like, "Oh, we're gonna buy someone," and
No,
so
so they
they
probably did
weren't
right.
sure if they were gonna continue. That was 5 years ago or something.
Hmm.
So, and then what a lot of colleges do, like comparing it. So you have that, you can tell just by the syllabus. Then let's say you have your internal program, the syllabus will be different because they'll be taking content from the university for your degree. So that syllabus will be different. So if you get syllabi from each version of the program, you'll be able to compare and tell the difference.
Okay, so I'm ignorant of this somewhat. So, like, help me explain the difference between a certificate and a 4-year degree. A 4-year degree is going to require maybe language, science. You're going to have to take a
Yes,
geology class. You're going to have like these humanities and stuff. A
all the
certificate,
standard,
right? A certificate wouldn't include that,
none of
but
that.
in the 4-year program, you're going to take the courses that would be in the certificate
Yes.
along with the humanities to get that more well-rounded education. The certificate is just the core stuff minus the humanities and whatever the
Right.
electives and all that crap. Oh, okay,
Exactly.
all right, I see. All
Yeah.
right, that makes a lot of sense.
That's
Okay,
a really good way of putting it. Yeah, you
okay.
don't. I had a hard time because I forgot about that. I went to college. We were not required to do any of those 2 years of humanities.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, so I actually got a bachelor's degree in 3 years. And the only reason it took me
Wow.
3 years is because I took extra classes. They're like, stop taking classes. It's so many.
That's hilarious.
But I
Yeah,
went to a very special school, so
I would do what I would do is I would take a bunch of classes just so I could drop them all in case I failed them. That was that's why I took a lot longer than 3 years to graduate. So I'm curious, like from your perspective, though. Again, we're saying these things are different. It's not to say they're bad. Is any one of them worse than the other from your perspective, or they all just sort of depends on what you need and what can help you meet your ultimate goal, your
yeah, I think it
outcome?
would all depend on what you need and, meeting that ultimate goal, like to your point, and how you learn and absorb information, because those boot camps move fast. Like if
Right.
you're like, I want to drink from a fire hose, that's a
Yeah.
boot camp for you.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So again, thinking about all of this and planning this out, if you're thinking of it as if you're doing a UX project, right? You start with the outcome. What's the outcome? What do we want to achieve? What is the ultimate problem? I have a thing I need to fix and I want to see this at the end. And how do you go about achieving that outcome? There's many different ways to do that. And the route that you decide is the best route for you, based on whatever your constraints, right? You got constraints, you got time, you got budget, just like you would in the real world for a
Hmm.
software project. These kinds of things apply. So I guess one thing, maybe that's a good caveat to throw out there, is as we're talking about the differences, we're not bashing any of them. None of them necessarily
No.
are bad or worse or better. It's just what is the outcome, what are your constraints, and how do you get there, given the constraints you have. So thank you for explaining that. So that's really good. So we talked about boot camps, pros and cons, university program, pros and cons. I can think of a few, but I'm curious, like from your perspective, that learning humanities and stuff is something some people might want to do, that kind of stuff. But what do you got? What's your thoughts there?
Yeah. Well, I think also to your point about university degrees, there's undergrad and grad. So, it depends where you are in your life. If you're right out of high school, you probably should do that. And I think you're required actually to do an undergrad, and then if you're returning to school, grad program is more, you're a career changer and so university programs, pros can be like internships, name
Mm-hmm.
recognition, more in-depth learning because it's a slower pace, 2 years versus, 15 weeks. So there's those pros, cons is obviously a price, although some boot camps are $18,000 for
It's
15
not really that
weeks.
cheap. Yeah. Yeah.
So
And
that's
I
how much my
imagine,
bachelor's cost.
yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah. It was funny. I actually, when I went to college, I went to LSU, which is, state school, and I got in-state tuition, and it was 2000 a year, I think. And this was, 2000. So this was 20 something years ago. So I know LSU is not that cheap now. Most of that money probably goes to the football program anyway. But anyway, yeah. So for that kind of stuff too, one of the things that I think about with universities, and this again depends totally on the university that you went to, but I realized this over time, is that often what you get with the university, aside from the education, obviously, is the network, the
And the
built-in network,
support, I
the
would
support,
say.
right? Yeah. So like, if you go to Pratt, right, and get a
Right.
UX design Pratt, you're buying into that name and that support structure and the people that went
Mhm.
there, and you're probably going to end up with a lot more opportunities than if you went to some state school in the Midwest or something, right? That's
100%.
something to think, but you're also paying for the Pratt name. You're paying
Yes.
a lot of money, for that kind of thing. So, it's something to think about a lot. The other thing too is the internships, and this is something, a lot of boot camps, I think, end up struggling, or people that have gone to boot camps end up struggling getting like real world experience, and I think about like where I work, Aerospace, like we go to UC, we go to University of Cincinnati, and we get interns, from their art program, and
Mhm.
they get to work and do stuff, and they get that real world experience. And so that's something that is also challenging, I think, for a lot of boot camps. There's options like Tech Fleet and other apprenticeship type
Mhm.
programs, but it's very different, I think, than a structured internship type
Yeah.
of thing where a company would go and recruit from a school, and there's a very specific funnel. I think that's also something to think about with universities. And one
Yeah.
thing that I brought this, I was talking with Debbie Levitt a couple of weeks ago, and I brought this up, and she was like, "No, this is not the case for me." But for me, like I went to Catholic school all through from like kindergarten to high school, and you didn't question, you didn't, you accepted everything, and you just, you shut up and sit down and sit up straight. And when I went to college, for me, that was the first time I had teachers encouraging us to question, and critical thought was a new thing for me. Debbie was like, oh, my parents were like a philosopher. I can't remember exactly what she said, but it's like, artists and all this, and like I grew up like questioning everything. So for her, that 4-year program didn't teach her that critical thinking kind of muscle, but for me, it was very different. So, I mean, that's something too, when I think about boot camps versus 4-year program, is the boot camp, it's like less discussion, less thought, less debate on various
Yep.
things. And it's more, this is the thing, go learn it, go do it. So I don't know. I'm curious from your perspective, is that something you've experienced with like boot
Oh,
camps
yes,
versus?
100%. I see a lot of people coming out of boot camps treating it like a recipe in the kitchen,
Mm-hmm.
honestly, because they're told this is what you do and not why. And there's no discussion of, critical thinking to your point of why you would do this. It's like, this is the step, do this step, do this step, do this step.
Yeah.
And I 100% agree with you. I went back and forth in Catholic school myself. I do have a funny story though. I only went to public school maybe 1 or 2 years out of my education degree or
Mm-hmm.
life. I don't know what we call it, but
Life. Yeah,
kindergarten
life.
to whatever. And my husband jokes that because I didn't go to public school, I can't deal with bureaucracy very well because I wasn't used to like the mind
Yeah.
numbing, like to your point, Catholic school was like sit down and shut up, but it was
Yeah.
like
It was very
very
top down. Yeah. Yes.
authoritative,
Oh, yes, of
whereas
course.
public school is just stupid,
Yeah.
and I never learned to deal with that. And I really struggle with
Yeah.
bureaucratic stuff like our government.
Of course, yeah. Which I guess if you want to, public sector employee, maybe that's a great place to cut your teeth. I have this funny story. I remember, God, I think this must have been third grade, fourth grade. We started learning about the Greek mythology and stuff,
Mhm.
right? And
Mhm.
the Greek gods. And I remember asking a question to my teachers, like, what if like in 1,000 years people read the Bible like we read Greek mythology? And she was like, that'll never happen. This is real. That's fake. This is real. I'm like, okay. And I was like, that's the kind of, that was like my critical thinking got cut off at fourth grade or whatever that was. So I kind of stopped doing this. It took a long time for me to get it back. So that's something to think about. So we think about like online courses, self-learning. Would you consider certificates and stuff in that class, like kind of self-paced kind of stuff, or some of those certificates like you were talking about are actually from the university and it is more structured, you are actually taking courses, so that's not really the same? How would you
Yeah.
where's your
No,
thoughts?
so what I consider self-learning is anything where you don't have a mentor or someone you can
Mm,
interact with on a regular basis. So
yeah.
these nano degrees or these certificates at Udacity or Coursera, I would actually consider self-learning because while the content is pretty solid from a university, you have no feedback, you have no
Mm,
interaction. So I consider that self-learning. The lack of feedback, it's hard to learn when you don't get that feedback. Or
right,
sadly, the Google UX certificate, like, oh my gosh, Google put the content out, but you get
right.
no feedback and no structured
And correct me if
questions.
I'm wrong, but I've heard from people that there's not even an instructor. It's like the
Nope.
teams grade themselves. So like people that have no
Yep.
idea what they're doing are grading other people who have no idea what they're doing. It
Yes.
sounds like a recipe for a disaster, and it's not surprising that that is not taken quite as seriously as you would expect a Google certificate to be. So anyway, that is something to think about. Yeah, that when I heard that, I was like, that sounds like just a recipe for like bullying and just like misinformation and everything else. It just sounds like I don't know, defeating the whole purpose of the thing, which is weird to me.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I'm really sad that Google put their name on it. And, I would say the qualities, like I would actually consider the Google UX certificate one of the lowest quality ones out there, honestly.
Yeah, and that's something a lot of people are like, oh, I took the Google course. Oh, Google did it. Google's a leader in UX and blah blah blah, and people have no idea. I'm glad we're calling. I'm okay calling that one out. They're big enough; they can call them out. So I'm curious, pros and cons from your perspective of this sort of self learning approach.
There's the price obviously is a pro. Like
Yeah,
there's
it's free.
tons of stuff you can do very
Yeah,
cheaply
cheap and
or
free. Yeah,
free.
or free. Yeah,
I actually help keep a database of what I call educational resources
yeah.
that's sorted by price in Airtable, posted about it on LinkedIn, and I think it's on my blog and stuff as well, where you can just find hundreds and hundreds of resources to learn UX for free. And so there's tons of information. So the breadth of information and the cost is obviously pros. Some negatives are length of time. You have to be very self-disciplined. You could just
Yeah.
keep learning and learning and learning forever and
Yeah.
never make the next step into like getting a job, creating your portfolio. And then obviously not getting that feedback. So when I do hear that, some people are like, oh, I'm gonna self-teach myself, which I think is great. I'm personally not a fan of ADP lists, but I will lump them together with a mentoring platform.
Hmm.
Go onto those and get feedback on your work. Like you can sign up for 30 minutes, say like this is the research questions I did, or research plan I did, or the wireframes I did, or the user flows. Get feedback from a senior person.
Yeah. Now, the thing with those types of platforms, and I used to be on
Mhm.
ADP list, I'm not anymore. The thing that it isn't against the platform necessarily always. It's the way people use the platform. And so in that case, if you're going and finding, whether you're using ADP list or a completely different platform, a random person for 30 minutes, the feedback that you're getting may or may not be applicable if they do not have the right context. And a really great mentor will try to understand the context before they give you any bit of advice and feedback. And I would suggest out there, if you're listening, I'd love to get your thoughts on this, but if you go out there and you find somebody for a 30-minute or 45-minute session, be wary of the feedback you're getting if that person is just giving their opinion without any context around what it is you're actually trying to achieve with this thing. Right? I'm
A
curious what your
hundred
thoughts are there.
percent.
Okay,
No,
good.
I
I'm glad
100% agree. And I did say that as a very offhand comment.
Yeah.
I feel like we could have a whole podcast on just
Yes, we could.
find a good mentor and know that someone's mentoring you well and
Yes.
things like that. Context. And then, even if you do have all that context and you get, like, let's say you get me first I'm also
Mm-hmm.
no longer on ADP list for other reasons, but I give you feedback, you give me context, I give you feedback, but then someone goes to you next week, they're going to get totally different
Yeah.
feedback because the lack of consistency. And no matter how good a mentor you have, they bring their own personal biases and
Yeah.
knowledge with them. And that's just part of it. So it's not as good as having a consistent, structured educator in your corner.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually self-taught. And so I went this route long before there were actually courses and stuff online, a lot of books and O'Reilly books and things like that.
That's how I
Um,
did it as well.
yeah, that was like back when books came with CDs of
Yeah.
but so nowadays though, one of the things that, there are so many of these like sort of self-paced courses. I have ADD, ADHD, whatever.
That's a
And
really
something to think about is like that self-paced course. You mentioned the opposite of like what someone with ADD might have, where you just keep learning and keep learning. But someone from ADD might actually just procrastinate, never start, jump from one thing to the next before they actually learn anything, and catch whatever catches their eye. They'll hop back and forth. So if that's you, the maybe there some of these other options out there are maybe better for somebody that's got ADD or something that has a really hard time focusing and has a problem with procrastinating and things like that. I can tell you from my personal experience, I had a very hard time, and it took me a while to get to where I am because of that. So I'm curious, the cons and stuff for self learning. Any other cons or things like that? I mean, obviously, like the mentor not having the feedback. But are there any other ones? I'm curious.
just knowing like what content is quote unquote, I'm going to use a label, I apologize, good
Mm-hmm.
versus, just is it backed up by research? Can you validate it? And to your point, like if you don't already have critical thinking skills, it can be really hard to judge,
Yeah.
is this
Okay.
content worth me learning, or is this just someone spitting something out because they think they should or they want to?
Right. Okay. So you mentioned good. Let's talk about good versus bad for a second. And we talked about all three options. What I would love to do, if you are willing,
Yeah.
I'd like to go through the various options: bootcamp, university, and self-learning, and talk about what someone should look for, red flags, green flags, things that you can say, I think this would be high quality if I see this, or if I see this, maybe run away. Is it possible? And again, universities, boot camps, they're not monoliths. There's a lot of different ways that you could do these things, so it's hard to say necessarily. But Can we go through those? Would that be something we could do?
Sure.
I'd love to. Cool. So let's talk about boot camp. Let's talk
Yep.
about red flags first. When you see something at a boot camp, what turns you off immediately and should give you warning signs that this is probably not worth the money?
Okay, and I do come with some personal biases. I'm just throwing that out there. But for me, one thing,
That's
like
fair.
a big thing is, and I see this even in job ads for mentors at boot camps. So with boot camps, you rarely have instructors. You might, some
Mm-hmm.
of them do. You have mentors.
Mm-hmm.
So two things, how, like, I am also not a believer in years of experience equals the
Mm-hmm.
quality or how senior you are.
Yeah.
A lot of boot camps get people who just graduated their boot camp to be mentors or tutors. And so they
Mm-hmm.
don't have any real world experience to bring to play with the feedback. So I see that a lot. That's probably one of my biggest red flags
Mm-hmm.
is, your mentor just graduated 6 months ago or something like that. Another red flag I see is, so let's say I was going to look for a boot camp. I would probably go to all the big ones and download the syllabi for each
Mm-hmm.
boot camp and compare those. Some things to keep in mind when you look at those is how they use the terminology, which can be hard if you don't, aren't familiar with it, but you can look it up. Like there's a sort of UX dictionary called UX Lex, put on by Curiosity Tank by Michelle Ronson. It's free. It's on Curiosity Tank slash UX Lex, and look up terms and are the syllabi using the terms correctly. So honestly, a red flag for me, and I know this is where my bias is coming in, UX UI, if they are a UX slash UI certificate, I'm like, nope,
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah.
You don't totally like, I'll either they'll be too focused on visual, or they don't fully understand the critical thinking and structure that goes behind a UX platform and like designing software or solving a problem.
Yeah, I'm with you on the UX UI. I'm maybe not as vehemently opposed to it as someone like Darren Hood who refuses
Yeah.
to acknowledge it, for
Yeah.
good reason I think. But I'll go along with it, and so I'll allow it in some cases. But I agree for me, especially if you're spending, like you said, $18,000, $20,000. It's not like you're doing a free course, and you can just I didn't like it, trash it and move on to the
Right.
next one. I would be very careful of UX UI, and it's hard to, and I feel like this is sort of like the feedback loop of the way a lot of like, just capitalism in general works, right? Like people call it UX UI, boot camps call it UX UI because that's what people are calling it. So then they call it UX UI, then more people call it UX UI, and then you end up with this sort of like death spiral into misinformation, I guess, as Darren Hood would say. But that's sort of one thing to keep in mind. It's like that UX UI playing into that. I don't know. It just I don't know. I'm with you on that one. That one UX UI. I did a whole episode about it, and I said something like my eyes roll in the back of my head. I got a lot of crap for that, but I mean, to me, that's something like I definitely think is worth calling out. What else? Any other red flags? Like when you look at the syllabus and you see being taught one thing versus another, how you're being taught. What are some things like a junior or not even pre-junior, someone who's just getting in, wouldn't even really know to look out for? So how can you? Any advice you could give them on things like if they try to teach it this way or don't teach this thing, be careful.
Yeah, so I like to, in a syllabi, I want to see user flows in there. You'll be surprised how many people don't do information
Mm,
architecture
yeah.
in there. You'll be surprised how many just skip right by that kind of information.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so those are some key things that I look for in the syllabi as far as like in the quote unquote design section. In the research section, I like to see a differentiation between primary and secondary
Oh, great
research,
call out. Yeah.
and which I hardly ever see. Another
Yeah.
thing is, okay, you're going to do research and you're going to do, when I see personas, empathy maps, I feel like there's a third one, journey maps.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like all three of those, like you're just going to output all three of those, but then they
Mm-hmm.
don't tell you why or when is the best time to use different ones. There's a couple issues. So I'm going to say this, and you're going to be like, well, none of them do this.
Mm-hmm.
Some really consistent issues I've seen with every single boot camp person I've talked to, which I feel like is a hard thing to say, is A, not understanding the difference between proto personas and personas. So proto
Mm.
personas or you don't actually do any interviews and you're
Hmm.
just doing secondary research, their hypotheses. So I've never seen a boot camp call that out in their syllabus. And then I was literally just talking to someone else yesterday. I was reviewing a portfolio and I was like, every single boot camp has you do this. And I totally just blanked on what that was.
There's
So I think
I don't know,
that,
like competitive analysis is one that I've seen a lot of them do. And
yeah.
I'm like, that's not something a UX designer, that's something usually like a product team, a marketing team. Hopefully, like the leadership team has done that before they decided to go build this thing. It's not like they're just going to take this idea of like, oh, UX designer, go do it. That team, it's such a weird thing that UX that they teach competitive analysis. I just don't understand it. I really don't.
Well,
That
they
makes
don't
no
even
sense
use
to me.
the term properly. It's
Yeah.
like, oh, and then they don't teach you how to do it properly.
Right.
So it's just this made up sort of thing. Yeah, to your
Yeah.
point. And so I look at that too. And if you are, looking at boot camps, let's say, and this works both ways, ask like, can I see work or can you recommend some portfolios I should look at from past
Mm.
students so that you can see the work that people have done and you may not have the knowledge to be like, oh, this is good work or not good work, but it'll give you samples of what they're talking about. And you can be like, oh, okay. And if they won't, because actually I had a mentee ask General Assembly and they refused to give out this information,
That
just go
tells you a
on
lot.
LinkedIn
Yeah.
and search for people that went to General Assembly and look at their portfolios.
Right. That's really, I was going to say LinkedIn, usually these people do. But the other thing I was going to say is if you have all these questions for boot camps and they give you the cold shoulder, they don't respond, they get short with you, they get snippy, like who are you to ask these questions? That says a whole lot about the
Exactly.
leadership of the boot camp, how they run it. If they're not willing to share that information, watch out. Watch out.
Yes.
That's something that I definitely have run into as well, with people from boot camps getting sort of like, I don't know, like what's the right word? People just being like rude and short with people when they have
Oh,
questions
yeah.
about stuff. I know there's probably a word. The Germans probably have a word for that. But yeah, so that's something to think about too. I had another thing. Oh man, we're in the
Uh,
same boat today. I didn't get enough coffee today. Now there was something else I'll cut all this out. Was there something else I was thinking about? What was I going to say? Oh, I'll probably remember it in like 15 minutes. Cool. All right. So, I don't know what it was. The guarantees. So you hear a lot
oh,
about, these boot camps with money back guarantees and things like that. Um, I have a feeling I know what your thoughts are about money back guarantees, but I'm curious what you have to tell people that are out there looking and see these things and think, oh, it sounds really nice. I get my money back. What are your thoughts?
yeah, no, and I think that's actually what I was thinking too. So we were both like, and I was like, oh, I can't remember. Although maybe it wasn't. Anyway, yeah, be very cautious. Read the fine print, which if you're not going to, there's a simple Chrome extension that lets you see the highlights of documents like that.
Really? Oh, wow. Okay.
TLDR. Yeah,
That's awesome.
and it'll like simplify
I
that for
bet
you. But
ChatGPT
anyway,
could probably run through that too if you have
yeah,
ChatGPT or something.
that's
It's
true.
probably
Now that I've been using it since before ChatGPT
yeah.
came out. So yeah. But so one thing to keep in mind is those job guarantees usually require to be in a certain metro area of a certain size. Otherwise, it doesn't
Mm.
count. They require you to submit on a weekly and daily basis what you've done as far as looking for a job. Like literally, you have to keep a log, a daily
Oh my
log.
God. Yeah.
You have to practice design challenges. You have to do all this stuff. It's a lot of work. And
Hmm.
I've only known two people in my entire since 2000, 10 years now, 2013, that I've been working with boot camp students that have gotten their money back in
Wow.
10 years, two people.
Jeez. Good Lord. Yeah. So buyer beware, obviously. A lot of stuff there to look out for. We talked a lot about the negative stuff. What are some green flags? Some positive, some things you see and you're like, oh, all right. I like what you're doing there. What are your thoughts? Are there
Yeah.
anything for boot camps?
Yeah, no, I do feel like there can be some stuff. It definitely depends. Once again, like I don't actually feel like I can really recommend a boot camp anymore, but like one thing that I do feel like is a positive is Springboard. You do a 2 week like sprint with a real company. So any
Oh,
kind
wow.
of work that you can do with a real company. General Assembly actually is doing this now, and I'll see on people's LinkedIn, oh, I worked for a month with this company, but it's very regulated. And I know that a lot of the work doesn't go live. It's just we repeat the same clients over and over so students can say that they have real work experience.
Oh, they're not actually doing real stuff. Oh, that's
Yes.
shady. That's kind of shady. I like
Yeah.
that. No, so the other thing too that I mean, we talk about mentoring. Something that
Mhm.
I like when I see is when you have a mentor who's dedicated to you, and you meet with them on a weekly basis, a regular basis, but they're not mentoring like 50 people. They're mentoring
Yeah.
3 or 4 people, and they can actually pay attention to you and help guide you. That's something that I really like. I know, for instance, like Mentor Design Academy does that.
Hmm.
Not sure of like others that do, but that's something I think. Oh man, Springboard, is it Springboard? No,
Springboard does
Springboard
that.
does that. Yeah,
Career Foundry,
yeah,
Design Lab,
yeah,
they do that.
yeah.
Um, yeah, but I'm once again, I don't know. So that's something you can ask is like, I know since I've mentored at all of those, they say, how many students do you want? And
Right.
then you can say, so, and then, oh, that's one other thing I want to add to that is you get paired up with a mentor. You have the right to say,
Yeah,
this mentor isn't working. I need to find someone else. I
yeah.
have a mentee that went through 4 mentors until they found someone. And so another green flag though is you find that person you click with,
Mm-hmm.
you get such amazing if they know good
Yeah,
ways to offer feedback and to help you grow, you can have an amazing experience and really
yeah.
learn a lot.
I
It's
think.
just a little, are you going to
Yeah.
get
Now that's the thing that's hard with a lot of boot camps too, because this is my personal experience just from talking with various people, and I haven't really been involved with that many boot camps to say this, but my feeling is just like anything else. It could be the same in a company or anywhere else. If you could have the best, quote unquote, best boot camp in the world, and you get a crappy instructor or a crappy mentor, you're not going to have as good you're not going to have as good of an experience than you would otherwise. And you could have one at like, the worst, quote unquote, worst boot camp and get a really great mentor instructor and still get a lot out of it. So
it?
it's one of those things like, and to your point, if ask, can I switch? How many times can I switch? Am I, that's the kind of thing like you got to find somebody that pairs well with you. And if you find a mentor who gets offended that you like wanted to leave, like that's also maybe a red flag for like mentors as well. But that's something I think to keep in mind, that idea of being able to switch and stuff. So I really like that. So we talked about oh, I remember what it was I was going to ask you about earlier. You mentioned primary versus secondary research. One thing that I have not seen a lot of, and maybe it's just because the nature of the work, it's very hard to do this, but I haven't really seen any boot camps that promote, you know, aside from primary, but just like observational type research, ethnography, in-person research, contextual inquiry, things like that. Most of the research, and even if they are doing primary research, it's user interviews remotely. It's like Zoom calls with people or phone calls with people. It's not, and again, the nature of the work, how do you set it up so I can go watch someone do a thing? I mean, a lot of these boot camps, it's like prompts that are made up or it's make believe stuff. So it's hard to do that. But this is sort of something that I think, I don't know if what your thought is, but like when we talk about boot camps, I don't see a lot of people doing that, in-person type of observational research. Getting that experience is rare, if not never seen. I don't think I've ever really seen
So
that
it's funny
as
you
part of the
mentioned that.
syllabus.
It wasn't called out specifically, but when I was teaching at General Assembly in 2014, we did have people do contextual
Oh,
inquiry,
really? Really?
but it wasn't at a company. It was like at a store or
Mm-hmm.
something like that, like retail based or
Mm-hmm.
something like that. But what has happened, I think, is since the pandemic, now they're like, oh, we don't need to bother with that. Like the only people
Mm-hmm.
who would do it, which it makes no sense because you're perfectly capable, is an in-person boot camp would be
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, okay, no, everybody go out for the afternoon kind of thing like that. But yeah, now that the pandemic, they're like, oh, we didn't have to tell people to do that and it was just fine. So like, why bother
Yeah.
telling people to do that? So I think it's totally gone now,
Yeah,
but I'm
that's a
not
bummer.
100%
I'll be
sure.
honest, like for me, like I work in enterprise, so like that kind of research is a lot easier to do when you have,
Yes.
that
Yeah.
audience that has to come to work or they have to go and you can't, they can't run away, they can't tell you no. It's like I can imagine how miserable that's got to be going to a store. I mean, like, can I interview you? People are like, nope, sorry, good. It's like trying to bother somebody on the street in New York City. Like, imagine how many people are gonna just like give you the stink eye. But yeah, that's for me though, and that's something else to think about too. Is like, and I don't know, maybe this is too early to even think about if you're just getting into it, but I'm wondering from your perspective, any of these options, are there if I'm, for instance, I want to go work at a large tech company, I want to go work at enterprise, I want to go work at a startup, I want to go do this. Would any of these options be a better fit depending on the career course, the career portfolio that, as we said, that you're looking to sort of go to? I'm
That's a
curious if that's.
really good question, and I've been thinking about that a lot lately myself. And what's interesting is I actually feel like it's really frustrating is I feel like boot camps would actually be good for startups, but there's a little hiccup in that a lot of boot camps you're told what to do, and so you're not as flexible. Like I've actually been
Mm,
advising a couple companies lately, and they brought in some like boot camp people to like do some work. And they're like, but in my boot camp, I was told it to do this way. And
oh, which is like,
they
yeah,
can't,
the
they don't
opposite
have
of
that
what a startup needs,
flexibility.
right? Yeah. Oh,
Right.
that's really
And
interesting.
and so because, and the reason I say that, and so if you want to go to an enterprise company, I think a university undergrad or grad degree is
Hmm.
better. And my reasons for saying that is every boot camp does the end to end. I hate saying this now, but just for simplicity's analogy's sake, the end to end UX process where you
Yeah.
start with research and go all
Yep.
the way to visual
Hmm.
design and usability testing.
Yeah.
And in an enterprise company, as I'm sure you know that, you don't do that.
Yep.
Like there's separate researchers, separate designers,
Yeah.
separate visual
Yeah.
designers. So you don't have enough depth to do that to go right into a
Hmm.
specific job in an enterprise company. You can make it work, especially if you're a career transitioner.
Hmm.
But I think especially if you're like pretty new and you're not familiar with the overall software development process, it's hard to fit into an enterprise company right out of a boot camp if you're not
Yeah.
familiar with tech.
I have actually heard of a lot of companies, and this again, it's hard to say. Not every company does this, but I've heard a lot of companies not even wanting to hire people out of boot camps because of similar things like that. And the interesting thing to think about, and this is something that I know we were talking about red flags, green flags, so at some point we'll get back to that. So I
I'm
apologize.
sorry about
No, it's my fault. I asked
that.
you a question that took us off on a complete tangent. But one of the things I think about is like when I go and do my daily, day to day job, that end to end. I was going to say wing. We say wing to wing in GE
Oh, okay.
Aerospace because
Well, that makes sense.
airplanes and all. We say wing to wing, which is funny because it should be nose to tail instead of wing to wing. I don't know why we say wing to wing. I guess the engines are on the wing, but we always say wing to wing. But that process is something that we very rarely follow, if we ever follow it at all. We're hopping around. You pick up something in the middle, maybe even if there was an
Mhm.
end to end kind of process, you might be picking it up right in the middle, or at the very
Exactly.
end, or wherever. So that and again, I think this goes back to sort of that idea we had before of like a good mentor should be explaining these things to you. Like, all right, your task for this week is to create a persona. We're going to go through how to create a persona, why that's important, but note that, like, this is when it's useful. You don't create a persona from one interview. Like these are the kind of things that
Yes.
a good mentor would be able to show. It's like the point of the persona is to share this with a team who didn't get a chance to do the primary
Mhm.
research, and this is a synthesis of that data to help explain and tell a story and blah blah blah. you know and so a lot of times though, like you said, the persona, that's something every boot camp,
They just whip them
they
out.
have a whip them out, and then they never, like, here's Jim, here's Jane, and then they never mention Jim or Jane again in the thing. It's like, it kind of drives me nuts. Anyway, I don't know, that's a good point to make about enterprise. I think that is true. It's very different, very very different from startups. But that said, enterprise, the interesting thing about enterprise is every team in the enterprise is different. So we
Mhm.
actually were having this conversation the other day where there's like this small team that they're trying to treat it like a startup. So
Mhm.
they get a budget, solve some problem, and they're sort of separate from everybody else. And so in that case, maybe you are doing that end to end process.
Yeah,
So it's
yeah.
kind of, it's like, it's hard to say. Even within these large corporations, they're all different, which again is, I think, really important to do your due diligence and do your research and all this stuff before we get in there. All right, so we're talking about red flags and green flags, university programs. Some red flags to look out for when you're thinking about taking UX at a university.
Some similar things. Look at, if you can, the instructor. I've actually had people be like, well, I can't tell you the instructor. We don't know yet.
Mm-hmm.
That could be a red flag, but maybe not. But, get
Mm-hmm.
that information before you're committed and can't back out and see their background. Look them up on LinkedIn. Do they actually have real world knowledge? So that, and then, some green flags are like the network and the name, unfortunately, but
Yeah.
you can achieve a lot even without the name. Like, don't feel like you have to go to some top school, but the networking is key. The internships are key. So I'd say those are some green flags and sort of seeing what other people do. So one thing LinkedIn is really good is looking up graduates and seeing what
Yes.
they've done and what their portfolios look like and what they've done since school. Reach out and ask them if you're thinking about school
Yeah.
that, and then some red flags once again, faculty who has no idea what they're teaching. One thing I see for both boot camps and university degrees, and I don't know why this shocks me with boot camps, content that hasn't been updated in years. Like,
Mm,
really? Like,
yeah.
what are people doing? You have instructional designers, you have subject matter experts, I would assume. That is an assumption. I do know Design Lab has lost all their subject matter experts recently, so
Wow.
that would make me very anxious. But yeah, updated content. So that's once again, you want to see the syllabus, you want to look at what recent graduates have done. So that's one thing. Like, if you don't mind, I'll do a small plug for where I work at.
Yeah, go
Copenhagen
ahead.
Institute of Interaction Design does a year-long program, and like I was literally just collaborating with the person who runs their year-long program, and we literally just added in an AI and ethics class for next
Oh,
year.
wow.
You
That's
know,
awesome.
the curriculum is updated every year.
Yeah.
So that's something I really appreciate. We're not accredited, but for specific reasons, they specifically chose not to be accredited so that they could update their content more frequently, because accreditation
Oh, I didn't know
does
that.
have things where you can't, like, you have to go through this. It was because I actually worked at another school that was going through accreditation. It's in California, it was a 3-year process to update your accreditation. It was an already accredited school. It was 3 years just to redo that, and you can't update your curriculum while you're going through that process.
Oh, that's
So that,
nuts. Yeah,
yeah,
talk
that was
about
in
bureaucracy.
California.
Oh God, yeah.
Yeah, so
Man, that's crazy.
bureaucracy. So that's something to think about. Is like, if you want the most up-to-date content, I would assume a boot camp, although I get worried when I look at Career Foundry or Design Lab and they have the same projects as like when
Hmm.
I was mentoring there like 4 years ago.
Wow. Yeah. So I don't know. I'm curious if you have any experience with this, but I know, for instance, that four-year programs like the business schools usually will
Mhm,
work with industry leaders, companies to
mhm.
help create a curriculum so that the people who graduate will be ready to work at those businesses when they get out when they're done. Is that something that UX or maybe the design programs, I guess, because a lot of times UX falls under design, but at four-year programs, do you know if that's something that happens? And would
Yep,
that
it
be
does.
something to look out for? So find a program that does work with industry to craft
Yes.
their UX curriculum. And is that
Yep.
how would someone know that? Is that a question that you would just ask
You'd ask it.
the the admissions team or something, I
Yep.
guess, or okay.
And they'll usually have to like get back to you on that because they actually usually, in my experience, don't know that answer off the top of
Right.
their
I'm
heads.
sure, yeah.
But
Okay.
yeah, it's a valid question to ask.
Okay.
And you can
And
even ask, can you give me an example of one person?
yeah. Interesting. Okay, cool. So, talking about this sort of online self paced type of things, what would some red flags be here?
Um,
It seems almost
yeah, it's a
harder to
really
say.
good
I don't know.
question. Yeah. I mean, I'm a big fan of like names don't mean everything. I'm not a
Mm-hmm.
big fan of like, oh, you worked at Amazon or
Mm-hmm.
Meta or Netflix, so you're like some amazing
Right.
designer. And so I think it's the same with materials. Like if you're, it depends. I mean, there's so many options for self-study. It can be helpful, like University of Michigan is a good school, Stanford. It's funny, I was looking something up and it said MIT was a good school, but it's like that's not where I would go. And you have to be careful when you do look up universities, and I'll get back to the self-study in just one second.
Mm-hmm.
Um, be careful that they're not mixing like technology in general. Like MIT, I think,
Mm.
came up because they have a good computer science degree and there's computer
Right.
science classes in their UX program. But I wouldn't say like, oh, you went to MIT, you must be an amazing UX designer.
Right. Yeah. I would
You
think like,
know,
oh, robotics or like, oh,
right,
you're
exactly.
rocket scientist or
100%.
something. Yeah. UX. I don't know about that. Yeah. That's a
Yeah.
really great point. Yeah, and especially with these, you're again, you're combining various courses, various classes, and so maybe if you are interested in computer science, place like MIT would be a great place to go.
Exactly.
So again, this is a really great point you bring up too, is like, think about the thing that you want to get out of this and the outcome at the end, and be very strategic in how you plan your education, just like you should be strategic in planning your career and your career portfolio. I love that word, by the way. I'm going to start using that. Just think about, be very critical about that, and think critically about those decisions that you're going to make. That's a great point. I love that.
Yeah. Yeah. So quickly, because I do know we have to wrap up. Some green flags for self-study is you do have so many options that you can look things up. And what I love is you can also do different types of learning, to your point about like ADHD or something.
Mm-hmm.
There's videos, there's podcasts, there's articles, there's newsletters.
Yeah.
There's so many things. And so I take classes all the time. I love to keep learning, and that's one thing I love about our career. So that I would say is a green flag. I don't know, it's just the options. Because I know some universities get a little huffy if you're like go outside their program to find other material.
Yeah. What's wrong with us? We're not good enough. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then a red flag is once again knowing what content is worth consuming. Or if you are like thinking critically, this is one thing I was just talking to a mentee about yesterday. Thinking critically can also be hard when you're doing it all on your own. So if
Yeah.
you are self-studying, maybe get a little group together of like where you can discuss ideas. Maybe someone's not giving you senior feedback, but like just discuss and think out loud and give yourself the opportunity to find other people in the same boat. Once again, Meetup, LinkedIn, there's so many opportunities out there to find a group. And it doesn't have to be in person, it can be online, as we all know. But I think isolating is something that can be a red flag with self-study.
Yeah. One of the other red flags too, I'm curious. I love your thoughts here. Yeah, probably feel like I know what you're going to say, but someone who puts out content or online about, and it's like trends, this trend, that trend. Here's the newest trends. Like I had somebody do these open chats every week. A couple weeks ago, somebody asked me like, what's the UX trends coming up in 2024? I'm like, why does it matter? Like, focus on the fundamentals, like find the fundamentals, forget the trends. If you want to talk about visual design, maybe there's some trends, skeuomorphism, neumorphism, whatever. But, the fundamentals, ethnography is not going to change. Heuristics aren't going to change, like really great information architecture is not going to change. Don't focus on the trend. So that's something too I've seen. Just like being on social media, LinkedIn, TikTok, Instagram, there's just, influencers everywhere trying to teach you UX, YouTube, and if I would, my advice, I don't know, I'm curious, I'd love to get your thoughts, but like if someone's talking the trend this, trends that, if they're putting trends in their playlist somewhere, I would be like, maybe watch out for that person. I don't know. I'm curious what your thoughts.
100% agree. And I think I'm glad you brought that up because I wouldn't have thought about it. Because when I do see the word trends, I immediately think visual design, not UX design. To your point, we have core fundamentals. Those haven't changed in 50 years.
Yeah.
And it's not like we can't evolve, but we're not focused on trends.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And this is something too, I think a lot of aspiring UX, maybe even UX professionals don't realize, is so much of what we do is built on that idea of, human machine interaction.
Yes.
Right? And before computers, like hundreds of years ago, the way someone used a loom, there's an efficient way to use a machine. And over time, there's an efficient way to build an interface on a smartphone. But those principles, the way a human's brain works, hasn't changed in 100,000 years, Once we evolved to be Homo sapiens, our brains are pretty much the same as the cavemen, thousands and thousands of years ago. We aren't really all that different. So the trends and things like that, I just find it so funny that like all of these things and these principles and processes and laws and all this crap, most of these were thought of hundreds of years ago, 50 years ago, before the internet, before smartphones, before apps, before the app store, all that stuff. And so I don't know. I always just kind of giggle at myself when I hear that people don't realize like all this stuff is really just not necessarily new. Applying it to software is new, but like, anyway, I don't know. Just
I totally
soapbox.
agree.
Get off my soapbox. There we go.
No, it's great.
Cool. All right. So it's 11:15. I have some questions that I want to ask you in a minute, but I also like a couple things was like one last question, how to make the most out of it. Do you think we have time to do that before we do the 5 questions? Okay, cool. All right. So we got to get out of here in a minute, and I don't want to keep you too long. But one last thing I'm curious about, if I'm doing any of these, boot camp, university, self-taught, how do I make the most out of it from your perspective? What can I do
Yeah.
to just make sure I'm getting the value, the whatever of all this money I'm spending, make sure it's worthwhile?
Yeah, so just know that none of these are magic bullets to getting a job. To your earlier point when we started, what is your outcome? Probably getting a job. What can you do? Think of each program as a scaffold and how can you build upon that scaffold to really get the best experience to prepare you to interview and get that job. So there's lots of things you can do, such as, networking. Networking should start day one. If you're a career changer and you're like, I'm going to move into the UX field, networking does not happen overnight. It takes time. So that's why I get frustrated when I hear boot camp people like, okay, you're done with your portfolio. Now go network.
Day one. Day
Yeah,
one. Yes.
day one.
Yeah.
I'm not going to go into details here, but there's lots of resources online about networking, and please don't spam random people on LinkedIn.
Yeah. And for a deep dive into how to do it wrong, check out Megan Thomas and I. We talked about this a while ago, where she posted about someone sent her like, because their boot camp said to go network, sent her like 50 questions in a DM. Was like, hey, when you have time, can you answer this essay for me, please? So yeah, that kind of stuff definitely does not get you the outcome that you wanted. So day one,
Yes,
absolutely. I think that's really
yes.
important. Um,
So that's
yeah,
one
go ahead.
thing.
Sorry.
Practice interviewing. Like
Mm,
it doesn't have to be UX, but I interview actually when I have a job. Like not like I'm gonna switch, but it's a skill that you need to
yeah,
practice. And there's basic interview questions that doesn't matter what field you're in that you need to answer. Like tell me about yourself.
yeah,
Practice those. I'm actually shy, so sometimes, but I make myself interview a few times every year just to keep that skill sharp. I still think
absolutely.
I need tons of practice because I hate it and I get social anxiety, but I make myself do it and I need to do it more often. There are a lot of AI things that you can practice with now to like get over that first social anxiety fear.
Yeah. Is it Google that has like practice interview type of session where you can actually record yourself and it'll tell you how you
LinkedIn
answered?
actually
Is it
has
LinkedIn
it.
that has that? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a few other like third party, I don't know if that's the right word, but also has it as well. I've done some usability testing for people, stuff on that.
Yeah. I don't think I've ever tried it, but it's kind of funny. I don't know, just thinking about that. But anyway. All right.
If you're really anxious and nervous and you're like, "Oh, I don't want to go like apply to a job just to see if I can get an interview." And it doesn't have to be a UX job. Just apply to a job where you might get an interview to practice.
Yeah, I love it. All right, cool. All right, Julia. Anything else before we get out of here that we haven't had a chance to talk to when you're talking to your mentors? Anything about UX boot camps or courses or self taught that we didn't get a chance to talk about? Any parting advice?
One last thing. Once again, you started us off in a great way. I'm gonna add to this. Just because you went to a UX bootcamp does not mean you have to get a job as a UX
Mm,
designer. There's researcher, there's operations, there's design systems, there's visual design, there's strategy. There's so many different niches, which is why I love this
yeah,
field. One
for sure.
reason, don't feel like I went to a UX boot camp, now I have to be a UX designer. Look at your background and how you can get your foot in the door in another tangential way if you need to.
I love it. Yeah, that's a really great advice. Yeah, and that's something too to keep in mind as you're going through all the courses and all the options is think about those things up front. And ADP list and those other types of things, that would be a really great way to just find a bunch of random people that have those titles that are willing to put their time out there for you to schedule 30 minutes and just ask them questions about what they do and
Yep.
just get their perspective, talk to 15, 20, 100 people if you have time and just get an understanding what they do and then find those courses that match what you want to end up doing later because a lot of those they are generalists, a lot of them, but some of them are actually niche and some specialize in various things. So anyway, that's really great advice. I love that. Yeah, the specialty thing is and being able to do all this stuff is I can't think of it, maybe like I don't know, the medical industry, you could be like podiatrist and ENT and all this stuff, but it's pretty cool. All right. So Julia, before we get out of here, I got some questions that I want to ask you to let all our listeners to get to know you a little bit better. Do you have some time to stick around? It's 11:20ish
Yeah.
right now. Okay, cool. All right. First up, what is your favorite non-design book?
Is a fiction book okay?
Yeah, non-design.
Okay.
Whatever's
All
non-design.
right. So it's called The Light Bearer by Donna Gillespie. I think it came out in like so it's, but it's a huge book about the Roman Empire.
Oh,
And
nice.
it's about 1,000 pages, but I've read it about 4 or 5 times and I just love that book.
No, that's funny because according to TikTok and the internet, only men are the ones who care about Rome. Explain yourself. Just kidding. I'm kidding.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite memes right now is the one with the men standing outside of Sephora and how many of them are thinking about the Roman
You know
Empire.
what's funny? My wife actually asked me this the other day, and I was like, "What are you talking about?" And she asked me this, and it's funny because like for the last 2 or 3 years, I've been listening to a podcast series that started with the history of Rome, and it was
Okay.
like the founding of Rome all the way through the end of the Western Roman Empire, and then there was another podcast that picked it up that was the Eastern Roman Empire, so all like the history of Byzantium. Literally, this podcast has been in production for like 8 or 9 years now. They span a thing, and I was like, I've been listening to this for a long time. Like, why do you ask? I thought she saw my playlist, and she was like, "Do you think about Rome?" I was like, "Only when I wash the dishes, because that's when I listen to the podcast." Anyway, yeah, it's really funny. I was like, "Is that a thing? Other men listen?" I guess it is. I don't know. It's kind of funny. I was like, I just think it's fascinating history stuff. But anyway, apparently men like Rome, and also Julia. All right, what is your favorite non-design podcast?
I don't know if this counts. 99% Invisible. Is that a non-design podcast?
It's usually on the list of design podcast. I'll allow it. What do you love? Why do you like 99% Invisible?
Well, I've only listened to it twice. I honestly am not a big podcast person. I
It's your favorite by
rarely,
default.
yes, exactly, because I listen to two instead of just like one. I don't even listen to my own podcast things. Yeah, I'm honestly not a big podcast person.
That's okay.
I don't listen to music either. I'm not, I don't know if maybe I have some form of ADHD, but
Uh,
auditory
yeah.
stuff is really difficult for me to focus on. It's
Okay.
really hard for me to like pay attention, but I'm fine with like video or
Okay.
like
Well, what's your favorite YouTube series? Do you have a YouTube series you like?
non-design or design.
Non-design, yeah.
Okay, this is really embarrassing. It's called Squirrely Wrath. It's like
What
a
is that?
cartoon. It's this evil squirrel and like his and he it's funny, I'm like considered like such a nice, like kind person, and it's this really evil squirrel that
It's
like
like your alter ego. It's like you're vicariously. All right. Well, no one will know. It's just between you and me. No one else will
my
hear this.
husband even has the theme song as the ringer for me when I call.
Oh, that's so funny. That's hilarious. All right, I have to check that out. I've never heard of it. All right, what is your favorite meal?
Nutella and apples.
Ooh, Nutella and apples. Apples. I've never tried that. All right, I like
Love,
Nutella. I like
love it.
apples. All right.
Yeah,
Do
love it.
you slice them in little like
I slice
things?
it
Or
and
just
then dip it into the Nutella.
all
Yep.
right, I have to try that out. My kids recently we went to Costco. We got this like giant box of Nutella and little breadsticks.
Yeah, the little I do not like those breadsticks.
Yeah,
I just
I
do
thought
not.
they were gonna be like cookies, but they're not they're not sweet. Yeah, it's weird.
Yeah,
And
I'm
it's
like,
like the
what is
bread.
this?
You know what it was? It was like the same breadsticks that you get with the cheese dip, which
Yes.
like yeah, it wasn't sweet. I was expecting a cookie. Anyway, my point is my kids make a giant mess with the Nutella. So like I have a love-hate relationship with Nutella because anytime my kids eat it, it's like everywhere. But I'll have to check out Nutella and apples. I have to try that out. What is your favorite vacation spot?
So it's a running joke with me and my husband because I cannot say favorite because I like lots of different places. I almost don't like the word favorite, but I will say Rome, Italy.
Rome. All right. So you have a reason why you like the history of
Yeah,
Rome and all that's okay. That makes sense. All right. I've
I'm
never been to
actually half
Rome.
Italian too,
Are
so
you?
my family
DeBari
are
sounds
in
Italian.
Italy.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
Oh, is there a city called DeBari?
There's a city, it's
Ah.
the largest city, I think, in southern Italy, or maybe it's Naples. Maybe it's the second largest, but it's the
Right
opposite
on.
side of Naples.
Do you speak Italian?
I used to. I do not anymore. I
Okay.
need been practicing though to get that skill
Yeah.
back up.
That was one of the benefits of a 4-year degree for me was I took 4 semesters of Italian. I actually almost minored in Italian.
Wow.
I took some extra courses, and you only needed like I think 4, 6, 7 courses to minor in Italian. It was like
Oh,
some
okay.
yeah, so it was like not a lot. I took 4 semesters, and then I was gonna do the other ones, and then I ended up dropping out of school. I never got the degree, but I did learn Italian, well, a
That's
little bit.
awesome.
Yeah, a
That's
little Italian. All I can say in Italian is I speak Italian, but not I don't speak a lot and not very well. That's all I can really say in Italian.
that's good. That's a
Um,
good.
That's all I need. What is your favorite design tool that is not Figma?
Pen and paper.
Pen and paper. I love it. Everybody says pen and paper. That's like,
Or
like
my
the
whiteboard
hallmark of
back
like a
there.
really great UX designer. Pen and paper. I think you actually were the one. I mentioned you on a podcast episode not long ago. You had a post on LinkedIn as like, if you can do it on pen and paper, you can do it on anything. If you can do IA on pen and paper, you can do it in Figma. If you can like do a wireflow or wireframe in pen and paper, you can do it in Figma. You can do this and that, you can do it on whatever tool. And I've used that advice a lot, and I always give you credit. But I use that advice quite a bit. I love pen and paper myself. I actually carry it around. I don't have it on me, but I've got like all these little field notes I always have in my pocket.
I have, me too. Same.
Very rarely do I ever write anything in them, but just in case. You never know.
Yep.
You never know when you're going to, always prepared. Just a good Boy Scout, always prepared. All right, Julia. Well, that is it for me for today. Thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. We learned a lot. We talked a lot about boot camps and courses and certificates, and we learned a little about what a certificate is. I didn't know what that was. So that was super helpful for me versus the boot camp and the online stuff. Before we get out of here, why don't you give yourself a plug? I'd love to hear where everybody can find you. I know you're on LinkedIn. I know you're involved with a million other things. Go ahead and give yourself a plug so everybody can find you and follow you online.
Yeah, no, I'm a big LinkedIn user, sadly. But find me on LinkedIn. Feel free to DM me or write to me in any way. I'll get back to you.
Right on. All right. Yeah. Please, if you know what you're doing, you're following Julia DeBari on LinkedIn. She shares some really awesome stuff, and you're involved with just like so much stuff. I don't know how you find the time to do it, but I appreciate your service to the practice and the community, and we are lucky to have you on our team. So I appreciate that.